It has been said that our interstate highways and railroads are arteries of interstate commerce. If that is true, then the great trails like the Appalachian Trail on which I'm standing and our greenways connect us to our heritage and our land while renewing our spirit.
There is another trail that is not as famous as the Appalachian Trail, but may be our highway to the future. It is the Mountains to the Sea Trail, a 1,000-mile pathway that stretches from the Tennessee border to Jockey's Ridge on the Outer Banks. Trails are nothing new in North Carolina. Many have been in use for thousands of years and date back to the first Americans. When European settlers arrived, American Indians had established trading routes from the mountains to the coast and from north to south. The Appalachian Trail is readily identified by a white rectangular blaze. It zigzags almost 300 miles through the North Carolina mountains from the Georgia line, along the Tennessee border, and into Virginia. It is the highest, most rugged, and most beautiful section of the 2,000-mile Appalachian Trail that meanders from Georgia to Maine. Here in North Carolina, there is a new blaze, which you may have seen near your home. The Mountains to the Sea Trail can be identified by a simple white dot. For young and old, this white dot can take you to adventure and discovery along its 1,000-mile route. Exploring North Carolina began researching the origin of the Mountains to the Sea Trail, only to find that it was started by one of our old friends, Howard Lee, who was Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources and Community Development in the cabinet of Governor Jim Hunt. Howard also served as mayor of Chapel Hill, as a state senator, and as chairman of the State Board of Education. I went on the trail with Howard to learn about the creation of the Mountains to the Sea Trail.
Governor Jim Hunt had appointed me Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources, which housed a number of divisions, one of which included in that was state parks. This was in 1977 when I assumed the role of the Secretary's position, and I served in that role until 1981. I had not been engaged in any way with either walking trails, hiking trails, or had any interest in trails when I became Secretary. I was going into this with a blank canvas, and so I was just really ripe to be molded into a person to be engaged in some way in trail activities in North Carolina. Well, I actually got introduced to trails through Jim Halsey. Jim came to meet with me and to make me aware of his role and to try and sell me on the importance of trails in North Carolina. Of course, he's such a persuasive young man that I did listen, and I became intrigued by what he was doing. And then later on, he asked if I would address a national conference at Lake Junaluska on trails. And I accepted the invitation, and he participated with my speechwriter in developing the speech. And in that, he asked if I would make reference to the possibilities of a trail that could stretch from one end of North Carolina to the other. And we put that in, and I made that speech, I made that proposal, and as a part of the speech, I talked about how this would be a wonderful trail that would stretch from the mountains of North Carolina to the sea coast of North Carolina, and that's how it got its name, the Mountain to the Sea Trail. Once it had gotten out there, I had to sell it to Governor Hunt at that time and got his full support, and I became intrigued by trails from that point on, and that's my introduction to trails and how I've continued to be involved since.
We also met with Jim Halsey, the architect of the Mountains to the Sea Trail, who worked with Howard Lee. Now retired from the North Carolina Division of Parks and Recreation, Jim is still a volunteer task force leader on the trail he helped create. I had a chance to talk with Jim about the origins of the trail and his work with Howard Lee.
I was the State Trails Coordinator in 1977 when Secretary Lee made a proposal in his keynote address for our staff and a citizen volunteer committee to consider the feasibility of a trail across the state of North Carolina. Being the staff person that was responsible for the State Trails program and also staff person for the Trails Committee, we took that as a charge and proceeded to explore opportunities to link existing public lands with communities in rural areas and urban areas across the state.
To begin a project of this magnitude, I asked Howard and Jim how they justified such a major program and what the rationales were for such an ambitious project.
If you know the governor, Governor Hunt at the time, you had to have a rationale and a reason for doing anything new. And so we sat down, and as I thought about this more in conjunction with others, we engaged the Department of Commerce. We also engaged the Department of Transportation, and we talked about how this could be a wonderful resource for economic development in the state by attracting tourists who would come and walk the trail. We envisioned that this could be a wonderful educational tool to get kids out of the classroom and to get citizens out of their homes and more active by having trails. We also saw it as an opportunity to tie together. The state of North Carolina has many parcels of land. At that time, they were just disconnected all over the state. This was a wonderful way to tie those lands together. But the more intriguing part was to get private landowners committed and engaged. And I was amazed at the number of private landholders who stepped up and said, we'll be happy to open our land as a part of the trail.
The existence of federal lands, state parks, and state lands and urban greenway systems, or proposed and planned greenway systems, were very big contributors to the choice about where the route went. You know, the Raleigh Greenway system was emerging in the mid to late 70s, and the two then new and even proposed federal reservoirs of Falls Lake and Jordan Lake were key features in determining the route. But given the national lands of the National Park Service, Blue Ridge Parkway, Cape Hatteras National Seashore, those were viewed as the major anchors of a trail. And then we explored many different ways to get across the state and decided that it didn't necessarily need to be the shortest route, that it should be the most diverse and interesting route.
Was the Appalachian Trail the model for the Mountains to the Sea Trail? Jim Halsey had the answer.
Certainly the Appalachian Trail was a existing, very successful long-distance trail. Even the concept that Benton Mackay conceived of in the 1920s included the eventual proposal to connect the Appalachian Trail to surrounding communities by a system of side trails. So in a certain respect, the Mountains to Sea Trail is sort of the extension of that idea, because we do join the Appalachian Trail at Clingman's Dome in the Smokies, and we go for approximately 1,000 miles to the Atlantic seashore.
When we looked at all of the possibilities and options that we had for gaining much more out of this whole trail, rather than just having a place for people to go walk, it was enormous, and certainly I think made a strong case on how the Mountains to the Sea Trail in and of itself could be a complement to the Appalachian Trail and other trails in the state, and make greater use of lands in North Carolina in a much more unified and coordinated way than we could have ever imagined otherwise. And that was the justification that we used to sell it to the legislature and, of course, to keep it moving forward.
Even with the support of Secretary Lee, Governor Hunt, and the legislature, there was still some question as to whether the Mountains to the Sea Trail would survive.
To be honest with you, I thought when I left office, the trail itself as a concept would probably die, because I didn't think that Jim Halsey would have the internal support to keep it going. What happened is many volunteers stepped up to the plate and both engaged in offering their services to help continue to develop the trail, to negotiate the acquisition of land, and to be able to complete the trail. These are people who care about trails and are willing to give their time, hundreds of hours, to not only help develop the trail, but to also maintain the trail. And if we had to pay for what the services we're getting out of these volunteers, the Mountains to the Sea Trail could not exist.
When you think about it, it is a bit presumptuous to think that North Carolina deserves its own 1,000-mile trail. I wondered aloud to my friends whether North Carolina is in fact deserving of such a trail.
North Carolina, I think, is a very diverse state, and it deserves its own 1,000-mile trail from the mountains to the sea because of the unique diversity of the natural resources and cultural resources, communities, and urban areas along the way. North Carolina has long been a leader in the parks and recreation movement in the United States, and a trail spanning the state is a logical extension of this growth of providing park and recreation opportunities. From many of North Carolina's largest cities, you're only a few miles from the Mountains to the Sea Trail. And on that trail, you can walk to a state park, to wild state and federal lands, to a small town, or you can even walk the entire 1,000 miles.
After being with Howard Lee and Jim Halsey, I began to think back to the many times Exploring North Carolina had crossed or been on a section of the Mountains to the Sea Trail. We had found the white dots in the Great Smoky Mountains. And been on the trail near Asheville and Mount Mitchell. We'd seen spectacular views from the MST along the Blue Ridge Parkway, views which are often shrouded in clouds. We know where it crosses the end of Linville Gorge, one of the oldest and most beautiful stretches of the trail runs between Pilot Mountain and Hanging Rock State Park. It passes directly through 24 towns, one of my favorite of which is Danbury, north of Winston-Salem. The trail passes by Falls Lake, north of Raleigh, runs along the Neuse River to Newbern, and eventually along the Outer Banks.
I wish I could tell you that I have hiked the entire 1,000 miles of the Mountains to the Sea Trail, but sadly, I haven't. But I have goals, and one of my goals is to hike the entire MST in the years to come.
In all of our travels across North Carolina, we have marveled at how well trails across the state are maintained, but it is not often clear who maintains those trails. I found out from Kate Dixon, Executive Director of the Friends of the Mountains to the Sea Trail, that very often the heavy lifting is done by volunteers.
Friends of the Mountains to the Sea Trail was formed in 1997, really with the idea of helping to promote and advocate for the trail. At that time, there was a concern that the idea of the trail might die, so the organization was really founded to help push it forward. Originally, a lot of the focus, and this is still a strong part of what we do, we have volunteers who build and maintain trail all across the state. But we provide hiking information to help people hike the trail, and we really advocate for it all across the state, building support for it and making it happen.
I asked Kate how many volunteers are now involved and how many miles of trail are open and maintained.
We have just incredible volunteers across the state. We have usually over the course of a year, just in terms of people who are working on the trail itself, more than 1,000 people. And they donate 25,000 hours of work. And there are long stretches of the trail, about 500 miles, that they are in charge of maintaining. So they make sure that the weeds haven't grown up, and that if there's a tree that's down, that they get it cleared so that people can easily hike the trail. They keep the trail blazed so it's easy to follow, good signage. They also are also really involved though in building trail and giving ideas about where the trail might go, where we don't have trail yet. In my time, we've built 140 new miles of trail in that time. A lot of that has been built by volunteers.
Having seen many parts of the trail, I know that it was built with passion, sweat, and sore muscles. Some of the volunteers celebrate their success with a Mountains to the Sea Trail license plate. Those who walk the entire 1,000 miles are given special recognition by the Friends of the Mountains to the Sea Trail.
We love to recognize people who've done the whole trail, and they get formal recognition in two ways. One is that there's a list of everyone who's completed it on our website by year. But we also, at our annual meeting, which happens the first Saturday in every February, we recognize them and we give them a plaque.
Although it is important to know about the volunteers who maintain the trail and the overland route it covers, perhaps the most important thing that we should remember about the Mountains to the Sea Trail is that it connects each of us to the land in special ways.
I've come to realize how much I have missed by not being engaged in a way that I could be exposed to these different aspects of life. And so when you look at the connectivity aspect of it, it not only ties together lands that are owned by different entities, it does tie together the species that move from one place to the other, but it also ties together history. The cabins that were once used, you will discover on the Mountains to the Sea Trail, either by religious groups or by individuals. I see connectivity going all over the place.
Jim Halsey, the trails planner, has walked the entire 1,000 miles. I asked Jim how the Mountains to the Sea Trail connected him to North Carolina and his heritage.
Certainly, I think we all appreciate the modern convenience of modern automobile travel and the interstate system. The reality is, though, that you cannot perceive and enjoy the landscape you're traversing at 60, 70 miles an hour in a steel glass enclosure. The advantage of walking, hiking, canoeing, biking areas of North Carolina is that you cover it much more slowly, much more intimately, and you notice things that you simply would not notice. The other advantage of going across the state on foot, for example, is that you encounter the state's people and its communities. Well, certainly it was an affirmation of a lifetime dream. It was also a way to remember my family and ancestors as I went through eastern North Carolina and remembered family reunions and picnics on the banks of the Tar River and Rocky Mount, all the way to the mountains, the Cascades picnic area at Blue Ridge Parkway, where I realized, looking at some old photographs, that's where my parents took me as a young child. And lots of time for reflection, and just feel very blessed to be able to enjoy that and pass that along to our state citizens.
Is the Mountains to the Sea Trail set in stone today? Or is its route going to change with a growing North Carolina?
Well, the trail route is shifting right now pretty rapidly. And that is because as we build new trail, we'll shift what we call the current route, which is where people are using back roads to make connections. We open new trail, we'll shift the route so that it goes onto that trail as soon as possible. But I think over time, just watching other trails, like the Appalachian Trail, that trail is more than 70 years old, but still every year they make adjustments to that trail. And I'm sure that will happen with the Mountains to Sea Trail over time.
I think any trail of magnitude of the Mountains to Sea Trail is going to be subject to route changes and adjustments. There will be new areas and new communities that embrace the concept that may not necessarily be on the current route or planning corridor.
Now that we have an established system of trails from the Tennessee border to the Outer Banks, encompassing state parks, federal lands, and private lands, and powered by an army of volunteers, I ask each of our guests how they envision the Mountains to the Sea Trail in the year 2100.
North Carolina has certainly been blessed because it has had one of the most interesting park systems in the nation. It has been a system that has protected its natural areas. The Mountains to the Sea Trail, I think, eventually will be the corridor that will stretch near, if not to all of these state parks. In the year 2100, I believe the Mountains to the Sea Trail will be equal in status to that of the Appalachian Trail.
My hope is that because the Mountains to Sea Trail has been embraced by the state's citizens and its political leaders and its towns and communities, is that the Mountains to Sea Trail will still be that grandparent long-distance trail, but it will be surpassed and embraced, if you will, by a whole network of connecting trails.
First of all, I think that there will be millions of people who use it. And that millions number sounds like so many, but you look at a 1,000-mile trail, what will be happening is that there will be people who are using it for just they'll be out for a day hike near where they live. There will also be people who are doing weekend backpacking trips. And then there will be people who are, many, many more people than there are now, who are hiking across the entire state and experiencing all the diversity of the trail. I think the trail will be one of the most recognized features of North Carolina.
Finally, I had to ask my friend Howard Lee, one of the most distinguished public servants of my generation, if he considers the Mountains to the Sea Trail to be part of his legacy.
I would be so honored if people were to think that I had a little something to do with contributing to the development of the Mountains to the Sea Trail.
Now that we know that our future is not only dependent on interstate commerce, but on wild pathways for the mind, body, and spirit, get on the Mountains to the Sea Trail or a greenway near your home while exploring North Carolina.